Thank you, Vicki and Raymond. That was a hard song. It's too bad you couldn't have learned the same song together, but it was nice that you sang those too. Linnell George, in an article in the Oxford American, says she always knew when her mother was homesick. She could hear her dragging the big cast iron soup pot with the bright yellow lid across the top shelf of the pantry. And within minutes, she could smell the flour browning in the oil, and she knew her mama was making gumbo again. Her mother was born and raised in New Orleans, but she moved to Los Angeles as a young lady because she had a full-ride scholarship at a music school out there. And she went in Los Angeles, married a man, and they had children. They raised a family in Los Angeles and never moved back to New Orleans. But she never forgot the roots of her raising. And so from time to time, she'd have to cook some gumbo so she could feel like she was back in Louisiana. And as she cooked the gumbo, she sang. She was a music student after all. She liked to sing the songs of New Orleans, songs by Professor Longhair and Dr. John and Louis Prima. And of all her favorites was Fats Domino. She'd sing My Blue Heaven and Walking to New Orleans, all sorts of other things. She wasn't the only Southerner that was transplanted out to L.A. Linnell says that there was a whole group of them from Arkansas and Alabama and Georgia and Texas, and that they would get together in the neighborhood there in L.A. and they would have cookouts, and invariably somebody would bring a turntable. And all the people from the South would bring records. These were the days before you could talk to a box on your cabinet and tell it to play anything and it would play it, or you could use your cell phone to grab something out of the sky and hear it. You had to have records. For you younger folk, these are vinyl things. They look like a big pie, but they play music if you put a little needle on them. And they'd bring the turntable, and everybody would bring the songs of the South on their records, and they would play them and dance and share memories and eat the food, and they'd feel like they were home again for a little while. We know our immigrant communities do that all the time. They gather with their own folks from their own lands, and they eat the food they're used to, and they play the music that they're used to, and for just a moment, they're back home again. That's what happened in L.A., but Linnell noticed that her mother never had any records to put on the turntable. So she asked her once, "Mom, why don't you have records from New Orleans?" And her mother said, "Betsy got them." Now, Betsy is not a family member. It wasn't a friend. She's referring to Hurricane Betsy, which blew through New Orleans in 1965 and just wrecked the city. Her family evacuated from their house, and when her father returned, he found all of those records that were so important to Linnell's mom covered in swampy water, and her father threw them out. Linnell said to her mother, "Well, why didn't you replace them after all these years?" And her mother said, "I knew all the songs by heart. I'd rather sing them than hear them." And then she gave a little wisdom to her daughter. She said, "Sweetie, who you become is all about what you shed and what you keep. Who you become is all about what you learn to shed and what you learn to keep." She said, "I shed all those records, but I kept the music." It's a good lesson. Who we become is all about what we learn to turn loose of. We don't need that anymore. And what we keep close to our heart as essential to our lives. When we get to the 7th chapter of Zechariah, time has passed. 2 years since we last read a prophecy. Zechariah was quiet for 2 years, and then the word of the Lord came to him again. In those 2 years, they had begun to rebuild this temple that I've been talking about. The walls were up. A lot of the interior furnishings were replaced. They still didn't have a roof. It wasn't time to put that capstone that I talked about last week in place. But the walls were there, and some of the paneling were in. They still had some cedar paneling to do, some gold inlay. There was still work to do, but you could see a structure now. It wasn't just a foundation. And even the most pessimistic members of the community believed, we're going to get this temple back. Our faith community is going to be restored. As they built this temple, there was a cohort from up in Bethel that came down to Jerusalem. They had a question of the priests and the prophets there. And when they got down, they said, we want to know whether we need to keep the fast that we started up there in Bethel to commemorate all the losses we've suffered as a nation. Bethel, for reasons we don't completely understand, was spared the destruction that Jerusalem suffered. Bethel was up north of several miles. Maybe they didn't feel like going up there. Maybe they didn't feel like there was anything of worth there. A few people were taken into captivity from Bethel, but most were left behind. The shrine was left intact there, the worshiping center. And so that community of Bethel, they maintained all the liturgies of the Jewish faith. They kept the festivals, and they kept the sacrifices, and they kept reading the Torah. They just kept it up the whole time that Jerusalem was in shambles. And to kind of commemorate the grief that the nation had suffered, they started 2 new days of fasting. One was in the 5th month of the Jewish calendar, and that was to commemorate the day the temple fell and was burned to the ground. And then in the 7th month, they started a new day of fasting to commemorate the day the Babylonians came in and assassinated Governor Gedaliah and wiped out their political system. 2 days. And on those days, they wouldn't eat. They would abstain from all things that brought them pleasure, and they would gather publicly to mourn and to lament. And so when they see and hear that the temple is being rebuilt, this group of people, the faithful people from Bethel, they come down to Jerusalem to ask the authorities, do we need to keep these days of misery and fasting and mourning going, or can we break out the celebration again? The highlight of our family's reunion out in Colorado this summer was a party that we threw for my mother. They brought my mother to my nephew's house, and all 44 of us gathered there. And she had some precious moments with each of her children and her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren. Somebody said it was like the Godfather was in a chair and brings, you, and they'd sit there and talk with her and hear things and ask her questions. We had a great celebration. We played some games. We heard some stories from her life, but the day passed all too quickly, and before we knew it, the time was gone. She had to go back to where she lives. So as we were doing our farewells, and there were tears and hugs, as you always do when you have a tender farewell, and you're not real sure when you're going to be together again. There was all of that kind of sadness. And then somebody asked my mother, is there anything else you want us to do for you before you go back to where you live? She said, yeah, I'd like you all to sing a song. Now, later on, my family and I, we got together, and we each said, as we relived that moment, that we would have bet everything in our bank accounts that she would have said, sing Amazing Grace. Because we sang that hymn at almost every family gathering. So we said, sure, Mom, what do you want us to sing? And my mother said, I want you to sing Proud Mary. Proud Mary. At first we didn't think we heard her right, or maybe she misspoke, or maybe she meant something else. So we said, Mom, what did you say? She said, I want you to sing Proud Mary. And so we got up, and all the women did their best Tina Turner imitation, and all the men tried to do Ike, and for a little while we went rolling, rolling, rolling down the river. It took me a few days to figure out what that was about. And then I remembered. At Karen and my wedding, during the reception, the wedding band did a lot of polkas because I am one of the world's greatest polka dancers. When they transferred from the polka, polka, polka to the covers of rock and roll, one of the songs they kicked into was Proud Mary. And my two brothers and my brother-in-law and my sister and I, we spontaneously, it was not in the program, we spontaneously stood up and sang Rollin', 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 Rollin' on the River. And it was a beautiful memory for my mother of a time of lighthearted joy and happiness. And she wanted to bring some of that into the room before she left. And she did. And that's what this group from Bethel is saying. We have been living with sadness for a long time. Are we going to continue this public mourning and grief and fasting? Or can we kick into Proud Mary? Can we get some kind of joyful celebration restarted here again since the temple is rising again? And to their astonishment, Zechariah said, you know, all those fasts that you have done, you didn't do those for God. When you went without eating and you sackcloth and ashes and mourned, you were doing that for yourself because you were grieving and you wanted to share the grief. Nothing wrong with that, but don't say you were doing it for God. And when you had your big feast where you partied and drank and danced and ate, you weren't doing that for God. You were doing that because you wanted to party and you wanted to feast and you wanted to sing and you wanted to dance. Those things weren't for God. If you want to do something for God, do what he's been telling you to do for the entire existence of the Jewish nation. Do what God has told you from the very beginning. From the days of Elijah and Elisha, from the days of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Micah and Amos and Hosea, he has told you this over and over and over again. Shed what God told you to shed, but keep what God told you to keep, and do what the Lord requires of you. And it's not another fasting day or another feasting day. Zechariah said, remember what God told you when Jerusalem was thriving, when it was prosperous and peaceful and populated. Remember what the prophets told you to do when there were villages teeming with families, not just around Jerusalem, but all up in the hill country and out in the Negev and the desert. There were people living everywhere. Our nation was strong. Our faith community was vibrant. Remember what they told you then. Now do it now. And don't act like you don't know what you're supposed to do. When my older sons were at the end of their teenage years, Karen and I used to try to get away. They were driving us nuts. So we'd try to get a weekend away. I don't know if you've ever been around teenagers, but they can have that impact on you. And so we would try to take a weekend away. We'd gather the young men in our living room. We'd say, now listen, while we're gone, do not have a party. Don't do it. Don't even think about it. Now, you can order pizza. You can order a video. That was back in the days when you had a Blockbuster. You can order a video. You can have a friend over, but do not have a party while we're gone. Evidently, one time we were in a hurry to get out of town. I don't know if we were trying to catch I don't know what. Maybe we were late. Maybe we were just so excited to get somewhere. We didn't have that talk. And when we got back, the house was a little too clean. Somebody had mopped the kitchen floor, which had never voluntarily been done by any member of the family. Somebody had run the vacuum cleaner. I wasn't sure they even knew where the vacuum cleaner was. So the bathrooms were cleaner than when we left. And our suspicions were confirmed when I took a milk carton out to the recycling bin and I opened that lid and it was piled high with aluminum cans. And they weren't all of the soda pop variety, if you catch my drift. Some of you look like you might have been at one of those parties. So I hauled them into the living room and I said, hey, it is clear to us that you did something dastardly while we were gone. Which one of you? And one of them said, well, when you left, you didn't tell us not to have a party, and so we assumed that meant we could have a party. That's the kind of nonsense Zechariah is dealing with. We thought you wanted another fasting day. We thought you wanted another festival day. God doesn't care about those fasting and festival days. Remember what all the prophets have told you since day one. And then he reiterates it in case they're going to still act like they don't know. And I'm going to call these God's favorite five. God's favorite five. Here's what God wants of you. Do justice. Don't have different rules from the rich from the poor. Don't let somebody pay a bribe and let the guilty off the hook and put somebody in jail. Don't have corrupt judges. Don't have corrupt legal manipulation. Do justice, number one. Number two, be kind to one another. That word kind is the word chesed, the Hebrew word chesed. It means more than just kind of a benevolent goodwill. It means a covenantal love for one another, that you're going to make promises to love one another with all your heart. Be kind, love one another. Number three, show mercy to the people who need mercy. The rich and powerful, strong, they don't need mercy. The folks who are broken and fallen and having problems and reeling, they don't need somebody to kick them when they're down. Show mercy to those who need mercy. Number four, protect the vulnerable. Don't let the vulnerable be oppressed. And then he says, if you don't know who I'm talking about, I'm going to tell you. Watch out for widows, for orphans, for immigrants, and for the poor. Because they don't have a lot of money, they don't have a lot of connections, they don't have a lot of authority. They can be hurt and oppressed and harmed and have no way of retribution. Protect the vulnerable. And lastly, be decent to one another. Don't you like that one? Quit being nasty to one another. Do no harm to one another. Those are God's favorite five. Now, I've never been politically active and never joined a campaign. I don't know if I've ever even made a contribution to somebody running for office. I am sort of innately skeptical of all politicians, but if I ever heard somebody running for office on that platform, on God's favorite five, if they were saying, you know, if elected, I'm going to seek and do justice, I'm going to increase kindness in this world, I'm going to show mercy to the people who need mercy, I'm going to stand up for the oppressed, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, the poor, and I'm going to cease all this nastiness in the public square, they got my vote. I don't care what party they represent. I don't care anything else about them. They got my vote. I don't need any candidates, and we're going to start hearing all this again. I don't need them to make promises they can't keep or shouldn't keep if they could. I don't need somebody to tell me I'm going to get more money if I'm in the middle class. I don't need anybody to tell me they're going to have all these government programs that are going to help me. I don't need anybody to tell me they're going to start a war or stop a war or build a wall or put an end to inflation or save all the rights or destroy all the rights or all the things we hear over and over and over again. I don't need that. I don't care about it. Don't bash your opponent. I don't want to hear all the lousy things you think you know about that person. Don't vilify the newest group to come to this country. Don't make fun of people whose lifestyle is different than your own. I don't need it. I don't want it. What I want is God's favorite five. But this isn't even a story about politics. This is a story about the faith community. What is the faith community supposed to do? It's about what the faith community, in our case, the church, is supposed to shed and what it's supposed to keep. And what Zechariah is saying, the church ought to be about God's favorite five. And if it's not, then nothing else really matters. You can build the most beautiful church on the face of the planet. You can have the most innovative technology ever put in a church building. You can have the most glorious music ever heard on the face of the earth. You can have the best preaching since the prophet Zechariah himself. But if we don't do God's favorite five, then you got a shell of a situation that does not please God. The pandemic has taken away a lot of our ministries. Did you know that? You probably don't. But we used to do warm nights once a year where we sheltered a lot of homeless people in the building and gave them food and allowed them to shower and use laundry facility, kind of give them a respite. But now that whole program has been moved to a hotel in Laurel. It's much better for the clients, but we don't have an opportunity to participate in that. Secondly, we used to every other month take a meal to Community Cafe, which was a free meal for anybody in the neighborhood who was just on the margins and needed a little help and needed a meal to kind of help them out. We did that for years and years and years, but when the pandemic hit, Community Cafe said we can't keep our clients safe, and they disbanded it. Our food pantry continues to run, thanks to Donna and others, but we've seen a great decrease in numbers of people coming for food there. It's beginning to tick back up a little bit, but we don't even know why. We think maybe there was food being offered a lot of places. We also think people were a little nervous about coming in and picking up cans and things, maybe. I don't know. But that has gone down. Maybe it will resurface. The only thing we do regularly now is we take a meal every month to the day shelter that's run by Congregations United. And even that group has dropped from about 50 to 25, but we do that. The point being, we're at a perfect time now to re-envision how we're going to do God's favorite five. We're at a perfect time to think, how are we going to get involved with standing up for justice? And what are we going to do to show kindness? And how are we going to work together to be merciful? And what can we do together to stand up for those who are oppressed, the vulnerable in this world? And how can we knock off the nastiness and just be good to one another, treat each other with decency? It's going to be a great discussion. New things are going to happen because we got to put that center, right? If we put anything else center, it's not a church, it's something else. And that goes for your personal life too. You know, there's so much pressure on our young adults to figure out what are they supposed to do in life and what is their specific calling and their mark on the world. And they worry about this a lot, and they flounder around, they try this and that. And I understand it's a very difficult journey to figure that out sometimes. But I want to add this. In addition to whatever you do with your career or your family, what God expects of you is to do God's favorite five. And if you do those, you are a success in the eyes of God. Can you say amen to that? You're a success. You've hit the mark. You've done what you're supposed to do. Seek justice. Be kind. Show mercy. Protect the vulnerable. And knock off the nastiness. You can do that, and you're pleasing in God's eyes regardless of what else you do. Last week, Warner Brothers, they put an end to a movie. The movie was called Batgirl. Have you all been excited about seeing that? I can just see it in your faces. You couldn't wait for Batgirl to come. Warner Brothers spent $90 million, let me say that again, $90 million making this movie. The movie's made, it's done. It had a wonderful cast. It had all the special effects you could want. It had a tremendous fan base that was waiting to see it on HBO Max. They were counting down the days. But before Warner Brothers released it, they showed it to a variety of test audiences around the country, and they found that nobody liked it. Not a single person liked it. They thought it was the worst movie they had seen in years. And when they looked at it again, they realized that they had the cast, and they had the special effects. They simply had no script. The content of the movie was missing. They thought they could just flash and thrill us and that would be it. It had no content. And as a result, that movie will never, ever be seen. They're not going to show it anywhere. They buried it. They probably burned it by now. They're going to take the insurance loss rather than hurt their brand name to release a movie that has no content. If we put our emphasis on the externals, we might create a church that looks good from the outside, but has no content. So let us hear the words of the prophets that have been said for 3,000 years, and let us do God's favorite 5. And the Lord will bless us and be happy with us. Amen? Amen. Amen.